Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I am talking to Australia's 28th Prime Minister and the 15th Leader of the Liberal Party. I hope I've got that correct. Tony Abbott. Thank you for joining me on Afternoon Light, Tony.
Georgina, it's lovely to be with you, and I don't know whether I'm the 15th Liberal leader, but yes, I was certainly the 28th Prime Minister.
I went on the Liberal Party's website and counted. So if my counting and arithmetic is accurate, then you are the 15th Liberal leader, which actually doesn't seem that many, does it, when you think of the, as of next year, 80-year history? There's obviously been some after you.
So what's that? That's, we've, on average, roughly 5 years, which I guess...
For a CEO, that's pretty normal.
It's not bad. Yeah. I mean, I was the leader for 6 years, and I think after Menzies, Howard and Fraser, that makes me the fourth longest serving Liberal leader.
Well, there you go. Well, speaking of the Liberal Party, I would love to start our discussion and appreciate that you have just got off a flight from Morocco, so you're doing incredibly well. You're looking very hale and hearty. But if we could delve into the past a bit, could you tell me how you came to be a member of the Liberal Party? What drew you to Menzies Liberal Party?
Well, Georgina, I was initially drawn to be interested in public life by the Jesuits. Yeah. The Jesuits back in the early 1970s talked about being a man for others. I hope they still talk about being a man for others, but I haven't been in a Jesuit school for more than 40 years. But then they certainly did stress that you should be a man for others. And for me, that meant at least thinking about public life. Now, when I got to university, I fell under the wonderful spell of the late, great B.A. Santa Maria.
Yes.
I joined the Democratic Club, which was the National Civic Council's campus wing. I got very involved in student politics as a Democratic Club activist, I guess. I did join the Liberal Club at Sydney University, but in those days, the Liberal Club at Sydney University was more social than it was political. And in fact, the first, I think the only time I've ever been involved in a branch stack was getting a whole lot of my college mates to join the Sydney University Liberal Club, and we took it over, and it did become much more political. In fact, it became very closely aligned with the Democratic Club, not surprisingly, and with the help of A, the Democratic Club, and B, the Liberal Club, I became the SRC president in 1978 and on the University Senate in 1979. But I want to stress, this was not about political success for political success's sake. Back then, the SRC was very, very left-wing. It's probably even more left-wing now, but society was less left-wing.
Sure.
And so the contrast between what was still a relatively conservative society and a very radical Marxist operation on campus was very sharp. I can remember, for instance, the second or third edition of Honi Soit in 1976. I think it rejoiced in the name of the Homo Honi, and it was all about gay rights. Now, I guess that doesn't shock us now, but I've got to say, as an innocent kid from a Catholic school, it certainly shocked me back then. And then I think another early episode of Honi Soit was instructions on how to create your own atomic bomb to blow away capitalist society. Well,
right. Okay.
Not being an engineer or a scientist, I don't know how accurate the instructions were. I suspect they were grievously inaccurate, but nevertheless, that was the tenor.
Yeah.
That was the tenor of the place.
And for those who aren't familiar with it, Honi Soit was the
Sydney University
paper.
Student paper. I was determined to do what I could to create a more reasonable, more decent, more, for want of a better word, wholesome atmosphere in the place. And that was why I got involved. In 1976, I got elected at the end of the year to the SRC. I got re-elected in 77, became the president in 78. Then after I got off the Senate, I decided that it really was time to start studying. And so in my last year at uni, I studied quite hard and did quite well. But I've got to say I was pretty much, when I wasn't going to Manning Bar, when I wasn't enjoying a pretty active social life or playing rugby, I was essentially in those days a full-time student politician.
And what were the issues that you focused on aside from broadly making things a bit more reasonable?
The big campaign, which I led, was voluntary student unionism. Yeah. I wanted the SRC fee to be optional. I didn't think we were spending it so smartly that people should be compulsorily levied their $20 or $30 or whatever it was a year. And sadly, I failed in my bid to make student unionism voluntary at Sydney University, but I did succeed in taking Sydney University out of the Australian Union of Students. And in that particular campaign, I was acting in concert with a whole lot of other people who ultimately became quite significant in our public life, people like Peter Costello, Michael Kroger, Michael Yapsley, Erica Betts. These were all very prominent in student politics at about the same time that I was.
And of course, eventually, it was the Howard government, wasn't it, did get rid of compulsory student unionism in the final years, didn't it?
It did indeed. Now,
when Brendan Nelson was education minister.
It did indeed. Now, I don't know what's happened since then. I suspect one way or another it was brought back by the Rudd-Gillard government, and I didn't have long enough in office to turn my mind back to topics like this. But certainly I thought then, and I still think, that all forms of unionism should be voluntary. I can see why you might want to be a member of some unions in some circumstances, but I certainly think that it shouldn't be mandatory for anyone, anywhere. I certainly think that there are some organisations which are so hopelessly misguided that your institution is better off out of them. So I guess what I learned from my time in student politics was that it was important to have beliefs. It was important to convert those beliefs into practical initiatives, and it was important to fight for them. And I also discovered that it helped in your fight if you had some really good comrades or soulmates even. And for instance, quite apart from those names that I've already mentioned, my best friend at Sydney University, certainly in student politics, was Greg Sheridan, who's gone on to be a wonderful contributor to our public life as a journalist and more recently as an author. His two recent books on Christianity, magnificent works, and anyone who is interested in the Holy Faith certainly should read Greg's books. And frankly, I wish there were more bishops who would write as well and as strongly as Greg does.
So that brings me to my second question, Tony, which is the influence of your faith on your life more broadly, but particularly out of university. And you had a strong affinity with B.A. Santamaria. You've said he's been cast as your political hero.
He was my first political mentor. Yeah. He was my first political mentor. Look, I've always taken Catholicism seriously. I've never been a very good Catholic, Georgina. I've always kicked over the traces. I don't think I've ever been particularly good at adhering to the various rules, but nevertheless, I've always taken the faith seriously. I still take it seriously, even though I'm probably not quite as observant today as I was as a younger man. Faith in the sense of believing that you've got a personal relationship with the risen Lord, that has often eluded me. Certainly it's waxed and waned, but I've always had enormous respect for the church in all its forms, and I've always believed that faith, religious faith, any faith, but in my case the Catholic faith, I think religious faith helps to get you through all the vicissitudes of life. I've sometimes said of the faith that doesn't make you good necessarily, but it certainly makes you better.
Yeah, well, indeed. You went after your time in Oxford, where you were a Rhodes Scholar, like some other Prime Ministers of this country, so it's a well-trodden path. You went to the seminary. How did that experience influence, I guess, your direction into politics and your foundational beliefs?
Another one of my great mentors was a Jesuit priest at St Ignatius College, Father Emmett Costello. And Emmett rather casually mentioned to me in sixth form or year 12 that I should think of the priesthood, and I instantly rejected the idea. It came back when I was at Sydney University, and I'd half decided that I was going to give it a go. Then luckily I won the Rhodes Scholarship, and I thought, thank God, that's Providence saying don't be a priest. Unfortunately, when I was at Oxford, or fortunately as the case may be, my best friend was an American Jesuit scholastic called Paul Mankowski, who I was in the boxing team with. He was the ultimate muscular Christian, Paul. Anyway, Paul, in some respects, the most admirable man I've ever met. Certainly an incredibly striking individual. And as someone who was a rough contemporary and who was able to give his life in this very difficult, but I thought very important cause, that motivated me to think maybe I should give it a go. Now, in retrospect, I probably had, Emmett's vocation or Paul's vocation. In retrospect, it was probably spiritual ambition as much as a profound faith that took me into the seminary. And eventually I worked out that I lacked A, the patience to be a parish priest, B, the depth of faith to be truly convincing as a parish priest, and C, I just thought I was never going to be celibate for the rest of my life, and therefore
Good to be practical about these things.
And therefore I was a square peg in a round hole. I tried for 3 years to persist, but eventually I realised that no, for my own good and for the good of the church, I should go.
You've joined the Liberal Party at quite a young age at university, and some leaders of the Liberal Party don't join till much later. So it was very young age, and obviously hugely active in university politics. But what was it about Menzies and the sort of stature of Menzies? And of course, by this stage, he's almost reached the end of his life. He's not politically active when you joined the Liberal Party, although he did have his monthly whiskey catch-ups, I understand, with B.A. Santa Maria in his very much later years. But what was it about Menzies and the Liberal Party that attracted you to that side of politics?
I was attracted to public life.
Yeah.
And I worked out that the party that best reflected my values and ideals was the Liberal Party. Now, I've got to be absolutely upfront with you, Georgina. Unsurprisingly, for someone whose first political mentor was B.A. Santa Maria, I did get to know quite a lot of people in the Labor tradition. For instance, at conferences, I probably shouldn't name the union officials who would come to NCC conferences, because even today they might find it embarrassing. But there were quite a few quite senior union officials who would come, and as you'd expect, they took an avuncular interest in the youngsters at these conferences. And then when I was a part-time journalist at the Bulletin, I got to know Bob Carr quite well. I came into the orbit of the late, great Jono Johnson, and between Jono and Bob, a bit of an effort was made to recruit me to the Labor Party. Now, by 1986 or 87, I'd worked out even the New South Wales right was probably insufficiently conservative for me, and I'd also worked out that the Labor Party was very much a creature of the union movement, and while I had nothing against unions and was indeed a member of the Journalists' Union when I was working as a journalist, I didn't think that unions were so special and so important that they should have their own wholly owned subsidiary as the government or the alternative government of the country. So it became obvious to me by the time I was in my mid to late 20s that if I was going to be active in our public life, it would be through the Liberal Party. And not for a second have I regretted that orientation. The great thing about the Liberal Party is that it can appeal universally because it isn't owned and operated by any one section. It's not owned by business, although it's sympathetic to the market. It's not controlled by the RSL or the Country Women's Association, although over the years it's had a lot of, I guess, like-mindedness with some of those groups. It's got a philosophy, if you like, or an orientation, if you like, which I think is at least potentially appealing across the board. And so I've been a very happy Liberal for the last 30-odd years.
For you, what is the essence of Australian liberalism?
Well, I thought Howard did pretty well when he said that the Liberal Party is the custodian in this country of the small L Liberal tradition of John Stuart Mill on liberty, and the small c Conservative tradition of Edmund Burke in Reflections on the Revolution in France. The more concise version, in Howard's words, were that we are economically liberal and socially conservative. I thought that was a pretty good way of describing the orientation of our party. My own version of that was to say that as Liberals, we support smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. As Conservatives, we support the family, small business, institutions that have stood the test of time. But above all else, as Patriots, we think that Australia is the best country on earth, and we want to keep it that way by building on our strengths. So we're the Freedom Party, we're the Tradition Party, above all else, we're the Patriot Party. That's us. That's what I like to think is the essence of liberalism in this country.
And you, of course, wrote about your ideas in your book, Battle Lines, and that was before you became leader of the Liberal Party, the 15th leader, we think, if our calculations are correct. How important was it to put in writing what your beliefs were? Because I've thought about this, how, in the United States, so many politicians or activists will put pen to paper or fingers to the keyboard and write a book about their beliefs. In Australia, it's much less common to see politicians do this. I think we're the poorer for it, because putting something in writing, pinning your beliefs to a book or a monograph, you're articulating what's at your essence, what you're standing there in front of people fighting for. If you don't, then, how do people get the measure of you?
Very good point, Georgina. Now, when I first got involved in student politics, I started to write a lot. I wrote letters to Honi Soit, and when Honi Soit refused to publish them, I started writing articles for the Sydney Morning Herald, for the Bulletin magazine, for the Australian newspaper, etc. So I've always believed that it is incredibly important to put your ideas on paper, because it helps you to refine them and it ensures that you are much less likely to contradict yourself, because contradictions are much more obvious if they're in black and white and a bit of paper than they are if you've just been speaking extempore to a rowdy audience. So early on, this was very much my thinking. Then, of course, I became John Hewson's press secretary. And very early on in my time as Hewson's press secretary, my former very senior colleague at the Australian paid me a visit in Hewson's office. It was late on a Friday afternoon. I think it was late in 1990. And Paul Kelly came in and he said in his magisterial way, and he's a wonderful, wonderful man, Paul Kelly. But Paul said to me in his deep magisterial way, he said, 2 questions for you, Tony. Who was the best opposition leader in post-war Australia? And I said, Whitlam. And he said, correct. He said, what made Whitlam the best opposition leader? And I said, well, I don't really know, Paul. You tell me. And Paul said, what made Whitlam a successful opposition leader was that he developed a program which helped to persuade people that he would be a transformative prime minister, and then helped him to be exactly that. Now, Paul and I went on to discuss what we thought were the defects of the Whitlam government, which we all think were massive. But nevertheless, that was a very important conversation that Paul and I had, and I certainly encouraged Hewson, as his press secretary and later his political advisor, to give scripted speeches. Obviously, Hewson, his great gift to Australian politics was the magisterial fight back package, which was a little bit too ambitious for us to win the 1993 election against one of the country's greatest political hunter-killers, Paul Keating. But nevertheless, the fight back package, it might have been a political failure in 1993, but it really was the roadmap that the Howard government largely followed in office. And fight back was a comprehensive distillation of centre-right thinking at that time on all of the various issues facing Australia. It was a wonderful achievement, even if Hewson wasn't quite the political salesman to get it over the line in that election. So, when I became a Member of Parliament myself, I thought it was very important to put a lot of effort into scripted speeches. I did it as a backbencher, I did it as a minister, I did it as opposition leader, I did it as Prime Minister. In fact, I was often chided, particularly as Prime Minister, for putting as much work as I did into scripted speeches. I was told that I didn't have time for that, but I thought scripted speeches were so important that you actually had to make time for them. The pity is that they aren't taken as seriously as they should be. And I can remember one day Paul Kelly ringing me up 20 odd years after that early conversation and saying, "Tony, you're making a speech today. What are you going to say?" And I said, "Mate, why don't you read the speech rather than just ask me to paraphrase it to you?" And he said, "Well, I may not have time." And I said, "But mate, what's the point of writing these big speeches, of slaving over them, of trying to say something that really is worth saying, that really does have meat, if people like you aren't going to take it seriously?" And he said, "Point made, correction taken." But this is part of our problem, Georgina, today. We treat an interview as seriously as we take a considered speech. And yet the interview is our attempt to wrestle with something extempore. The considered speech is the distilled essence of our thinking at that time. I got into enormous trouble as opposition leader trying to make this point in a discussion with Kerry O'Brien on the 7:30 report one night. I think I said, and I'm trying to remember, I think I said, "Kerry, if you want the gospel truth, it's in the things that we write down. It's not necessarily in the things that we say, because in the heat of the moment we can sometimes miss-hit and not quite get it right." Well, Kerry O'Brien was outraged. You know, Abbott admits that he doesn't always tell the truth or something to that effect.
Of course, yeah.
It was a 24-hour wonder, as these things are.
But you still remember.
Yeah.
But tell me, the 93 election loss, that must have really hurt. Appreciate you weren't in Parliament at that time. You were working for John Hewson, but you went into the Parliament the next year. I think that was, what was it?
We lost the unlosable election.
It was the unlosable election.
It was at least as bad for us as the 2019 election was for Labor.
Yeah.
Because we'd been in opposition longer and we had, in fight back, been very honest and upfront with the electorate. And we'd put a lot of very serious work in. So, yes, it did hurt to lose that election. And I can remember leaving Canberra, Margie and I and our then 3 very young kids packed up the car and fled back to Sydney, tails between our legs, and I certainly never thought that within about 12 months I'd be coming back as a Member of Parliament, because it did seem that we were in complete eclipse.
Did you learn lessons from that election loss that helped you in 2010 and then into 2013? How do you win back government, and how do you recover from failing to win back government?
Well, obviously you learn lessons because all your experience feeds into everything that you know and everything that you are. The problem in 1993 was not that we thought too deeply. It was that, having thought deeply, we probably just gave 1 or 2 too many hostages to fortune, particularly up against someone as effective at political attack as Keating. Interestingly, Keating did some fight-back-like things in that final term. He continued the privatisations that had started under Hawke. He continued with the modest workplace deregulation. So the fight back package influenced everyone, even its political opponents. because it was so intellectually credible. And so when I became the party leader, I thought, you can't fight on everything all the time, but nevertheless, you've got to have a clear vision for where you want to take the country and how you are going to make appropriate changes in various portfolio areas. And you've got to have a number of big issues on which you are prepared to engage in a serious fight with the other side.
When you enter Parliament in 1994, and then luckily for you only had 2 years in opposition, many of your colleagues, of course, have been, and including my father, had been in opposition for a long time, so it was a brilliant win in 1996 under Howard.
Yeah.
But of course, fast forward to 2007, back to opposition, and you did think about running for the leadership, didn't you, in 2007?
I did, and I put my hand up and almost no one saluted, as it were, when I ran my candidature up the flagpole. Look, it was a little wounding.
Yeah.
I'd had what was regarded as a poor election campaign, even though I think I was, by the end of the Howard government, one of its more senior figures. I was regarded as having had a poor election campaign. For instance, I was late to a National Press Club debate because the Prime Minister had insisted that I come to a health announcement that he wanted to make in Melbourne, and planes being what they are, it didn't work. And anyway, so then there was the infamous exchange with Bernie Banton, the guy who was campaigning against people's exposure to asbestos and was quite ill. And I made what was regarded as the grotesque utterance that just because you're sick doesn't mean you're entirely pure of heart on these things, because Bernie, and good luck to him, he was certainly trying to maximise the moral standing, if you like, that his illness gave him to make political points, and good luck to him. But anyway, I was in big trouble over that. So I was thought to have had a bad campaign, and Nick Minchin told me that I'd probably get about 2 votes, and I thought, well, there's no point, so I withdrew.
Yeah, but saved your powder for the next time, yeah.
Well, Brendan won. Malcolm was very unhappy about that. I think it's fair to say that Malcolm stalked Brendan. Yeah. It's never easy being the first opposition leader after an election defeat, particularly when you've got someone of Malcolm's skills in boardroom intrigue to try to tear you down. Eventually it was obvious to most people that Brendan's leadership was floundering, and there was collective decision that we had to give Turnbull his go. Malcolm didn't go so well. I think Malcolm's problem was that he agreed with Labor on too many things, and in particular he wanted to agree with Labor on energy and emissions. That caused a party room crisis, and Malcolm lost the leadership. And at that time, I didn't think I was much of a contender. At that time, the polls rated, I think Joe Hockey had something like 36% support to be Liberal leader. Malcolm Turnbull had something like 25% support to be Liberal leader. I think I had 19% support to be Liberal leader. Probably the person who was most favoured to be Liberal leader was no one. But anyway, I assumed that if Malcolm toppled, Joe would become the leader. And I was perfectly happy with that. But Joe then went wobbly on emissions and energy, asked the public what he should think on this, which wasn't a very smart thing for a leader to do. I think Joe subsequently realised that it was a pretty bad mistake. And I thought, well, someone is going to have to put their hand up for the leadership who is going to fight against this great big new tax on everything. So I did. I won by 1 vote, but because I took the view that the job of an opposition was not to make weak compromises with a bad government, but to be a strong alternative, almost immediately we started to turn the situation around. And the 2010 election, which was supposed to be a walkover for Rudd, was so not a walkover, he wasn't even the leader at that election, because under assault, he abandoned his emissions trading scheme. Then, having given up what he said was the great moral crusade on climate change, he then lost the leadership. Julia Gillard made many missteps in the campaign. We won the campaign and, frankly, we won the election, but we then lost the negotiation, given that Oakeshott and Windsor were never, ever going to support a relatively conservative Liberal leader to be Prime Minister. And then Gillard, having made that vow, there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, proceeded to do exactly that in order to get Green support for her ongoing Prime Ministership.
When you were first elected to the Liberal leadership, your Catholicism and your beliefs, they became subject of quite a lot of media questioning. Do you think you have been unfairly targeted for your beliefs as opposed to other political leaders?
I'm not complaining, Georgina.
No.
And I think it's curiosity as much as anything else. What makes this guy tick? And if he seems to take religion seriously, obviously there's an element of curiosity attached to that. I think Scott Morrison copped it much worse than I did. And I think in part this is a function of the age in which we're living. If you happen to take religion seriously, you are assumed to be some kind of Christian robot. If you don't take religion seriously, you're a free-thinking, rational, reasonable person, at least to the zeitgeist. That's just the way it is.
Why do you think, though, Kevin Rudd did press conferences in front of his church in Canberra, he wasn't subject to the scrutiny that you and Scott Morrison were? Was it something about being on the left that it excused it? Or
that's the only explanation I can think of, because people on the left are generally not subjected to the same level of criticism as people on the right. Kevin also had made a deliberate decision that Labor had to make a big effort to win back people who took religion seriously. I think he made a couple of speeches in the wake of the 2004 election. I think he made a couple of speeches saying that this was part of Labor's problem, and he set about consciously addressing that.
the 2010 election campaign, which obviously you didn't win because of the result of the negotiations with the crossbench, but it was an incredible turnaround. Are there lessons for Peter Dutton and the Liberals these days in never think, oh, well, you're destined to have a few terms in opposition. Every election is up for grabs.
Every election is up for grabs. Absolutely right. Every election is up for grabs. And I think Peter absolutely understands that. And I think that he's following a plan that he's worked out in his own mind. The first year is calming the troops after the trauma of defeat. The second year is working out the key issues on which you want to fight the next election. And the third year is refining the policy and campaigning like hell to get yourself over the line. And I think the next election, the 2025 or perhaps late in 2024 election, is eminently winnable. It's eminently winnable. And the reason why I think Dutton is quite likely to win is because the Labor government made a lot of foolish promises in opposition, particularly the $275 per household per year cut in your power bills. Power bills are going through the roof because of Labor's insane energy policy, which is all about reducing emissions as opposed to producing affordable, reliable power. They also promised to boost real wages. Well, at the moment, they're quite possibly driving us into a recession. That's not going to be much of a substitute for the policy to boost real wages. And frankly, this is a government which is really letting political correctness run riot. And the Voice is far from uniting Australia, which is what any referendum on recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution should. It's entrenching race in our Constitution. It's reinforcing the Indigenous separatism that is at the heart of disadvantage, and it would gum up our government even further. So good on Peter Dutton for coming to a strong and principled opposition to this Voice. And I think if the government persists in the Voice, and if the Voice is defeated as it should be, I think that is going to make Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party and the Coalition very, very competitive at the next election.
Tony, on The Voice, looking at the polls as of today, and I think we're recording this on the 13th of June, it looks like The Voice wouldn't get up. The polls are showing a majority of states are looking like they'd vote against it. Where does that leave Indigenous Australians? I've been at many events recently where activists are saying, if The Voice fails, then our hearts are broken and that's the end for reconciliation. You've spent a lot of your career working on Indigenous issues, both in politics and outside of politics, and you have been yourself a real advocate of Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. Where do we go from there?
If it was recognition, it wouldn't fail. But this is so much more than recognition. This is a power grab. It's a power grab by activists. That's what it is. This is actually the biggest constitutional change that we have ever been asked to make. They are inserting a whole new chapter into the Constitution, which means that the voice will become effectively a fourth arm of government after the legislative, the executive, and the judicial arms of government. And this voice will be able to make representations to everyone on everything. The representations will have to be taken seriously. The High Court will insist upon that. And what it really means is that the 4% of the population who have ancestry stretching back 60,000 years or thereabouts will have a greater say in the way all of us are governed. And I just think this is wrong, wrong, wrong in principle, as well as being bad, bad, bad in practice. And look, all of us want to see Indigenous people as first-class citizens of their own country. We all want to pay appropriate respect and honour to the first Australians, but this is not the way to do it. And thank God for people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, who are prepared to lead the charge for saying, in the end, it doesn't matter what our background is, we are all Australians and we should be one equal people.
Well said. Well, Tony Abbott, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
Good on you, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.